$25 billion. Yeah, you heard that right. That is the staggering financial cost of America's Operation Epic Fury. Just let that number sink in for a second as we begin. To really grasp the gravity of this, we kind of have to transport ourselves back to that precise moment of intense global tension. Entire regions were holding their breath, markets were incredibly volatile, and the sheer amount of capital being burned through every single day was literally astronomical. We're talking about a scale of immediate military expenditure that completely reshapes national budgets overnight.
But you know, the cost wasn't just financial. 50,000, that's the massive scale of the kinetic US troop deployment. We are talking about tens of thousands of soldiers pulled from bases all around the world and thrust directly into the theater of war. The logistical nightmare of moving that much personnel, armor, and support infrastructure across the globe, it's almost impossible to overstate. It's an incredibly loud, highly visible footprint that absolutely demands the entire world's attention.
And once those troops were in position, the action was intensely explosive. 900 strikes were launched in a window of just 12 hours. In practical terms, that is an unbelievable density of firepower. It represents a skies darkening level of air sorties, constant missile launches, and non-stop operational coordination. It was the absolute definition of a highly visible, incredibly noisy, and aggressively overt military strategy that commanded literally every headline on Earth.
But here's the most fascinating part of this entire geopolitical puzzle. While America fought this intense, highly visible, and incredibly expensive conflict, another nation simply sat back, watched, and secured a massive global victory. And they did it without firing a single missile. Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. Together, we're going to break down the unseen mastermind, how China capitalized on the US-Iran war. Through our analysis today, we're going to look at exactly how global power shifted in real time and discover how silence can sometimes be the absolute most devastating strategy of the whole shebang.
Section 1. The power of silence. When Operation Epic Fury kicked off, the international community fully expected Beijing to react loudly, right? Especially considering China is Iran's biggest trading partner. But instead, their response was just a few generic statements. No threats, no military posturing, just strategic non-intervention. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why they stayed quiet. We see a profound contrast here. The US focus became entirely entangled in the Middle East. As we all know, massive military operations require immense resources, time, and the absolute attention of a nation's leadership. But while Washington's eyes were fixed firmly on Iran, Beijing was quietly expanding its presence in the Indo-Pacific, growing its influence across Africa, and really accelerating its massive Belt and Road initiative across Asia.
Now, this wasn't some sign of weakness, it was a deeply calculated maneuver. To validate this, we can look at the analysis from the experts at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. They noted, completely neutrally, that China and Russia were sitting on the sidelines, letting Washington entangle itself in a protracted war and opening space for Beijing. Silence was the strategy. When the world's most powerful military is completely distracted in one neighborhood, it leaves an open lane everywhere else. Every single day the US spent focused on the Middle East was another day China had unrestricted space to build infrastructure, secure trade routes, and establish diplomatic footholds without any significant pushback.
Section 2. The energy masterstroke.
So the strategic ripple effects of that open lane were huge, but the economic impacts, specifically regarding how global energy dynamics played out, an absolute game changer. When the conflict blocked the critical Strait of Hormuz, the global oil supply was immediately threatened. As a result, we saw oil prices spike dangerously close to $100 per barrel. That sudden, violent surge absolutely crippled the economies of nations that heavily rely on imported oil. Countries like Japan, South Korea, India, and large parts of Europe saw massive spikes in inflation and crippling jumps in manufacturing costs. Everyday economies just ground to a halt as transportation and production became prohibitively expensive.
China, however, was perfectly insulated from that massive oil shock. Why? Well, a full third, 33.3%, of global wind and solar capacity belongs to China alone. Over the last decade, they've been quietly and relentlessly electrifying their economy. Renewables already provide over a third of their power grid. So, when the rest of the world completely panicked over the sudden scarcity and astronomical price of fossil fuels, China's manufacturing sector simply kept humming along, powered by the wind and the sun.
And get this, they didn't just survive the energy shock, they massively profited from it. As the rest of the world desperately scrambled for viable alternatives to incredibly expensive oil, they inevitably had to turn to the market leader. China absolutely dominates the manufacturing of batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicles. When the crisis hit, Chinese EV manufacturers and green tech firms saw their market values absolutely surge. They were literally holding the exact technology the rest of the globe suddenly realized it needed immediately.
So, to summarize the immense relevance of this whole dynamic, the conflict essentially forced an immediate acceleration of the global green energy transition out of pure economic necessity. And China? They won that transition completely. They expertly leveraged a global fossil fuel crisis into an outright green energy victory, significantly strengthening their own economy while their primary competitors struggled just to keep the lights on.
Section 3, playing the peacemaker. Now, what's really interesting here is how we move from the economic battlefield to the sheer diplomatic irony of how this conflict was managed on the world stage. While America was engaged in active combat, China took very specific, highly calculated steps to position itself as the responsible adult in the room in the eyes of the developing world. President Xi publicly called for reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Their UN representative actively voted against Iran's sanctions, and according to reporting by the New York Times, China actually helped persuade Iran to accept the April ceasefire. It was a masterclass in modern geopolitical public relations, projecting stability while a rival projects force.
Which leads us to this absolutely incredible historical footnote. Former President Trump actually asked China to send warships to keep the Strait of Hormuz open and safe. Just think about the massive diplomatic irony we're looking at there. The most powerful military on Earth was asking its biggest geopolitical rival for help in securing a critical global waterway during a conflict involving the US. It really speaks volumes about the shifting dynamics of global naval power and the complex realities of modern diplomacy.
Section 4. The $400 billion deal.
Behind all that public diplomacy and peacemaking, there are direct, highly lucrative financial ties operating in the background between China and Iran. $400 billion. That establishes the massive scale of the 25-year cooperation agreement that China and Iran signed back in 2021. It's a foundational deal that fundamentally alters the region. It promises guaranteed Chinese investment and deep security cooperation, meaning joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, and infrastructure development, all in exchange for a steady, massive supply of Iranian oil at well below market prices.
So here's exactly how that played out during the hostilities. A staggering 85% of Iran's oil exports goes exclusively to China. Because of heavy international sanctions and the surrounding conflict, Iran essentially has no other major global customer. So while oil prices spiked to that crushing $100 mark for the rest of the world, China was quietly siphoning off the vast majority of Iran's oil production through alternative shipping routes at incredibly steep discounts.
Section 5. Russia's unexpected windfall.
But, the systemic nature of this geopolitical shift meant the economic rewards weren't just flowing to Beijing, they also flowed directly to Moscow. With the Strait of Hormuz blocked, European customers were absolutely desperate for alternative oil supplies to keep their countries running. They had to look elsewhere. As Fortune magazine reported at the time, Putin is the real winner in Trump's Iran war, as it puts Russian oil back on the map. The U.S. administration had previously been easing some sanctions on Russia, and when that collided with the Middle East blockade, it sent a massive influx of desperate energy customers straight into the arms of Russian oil reserves.
Section 6. The final scorecard.
So the crucial point is, when we bring this explainer full circle and look at the actual measurable outcomes of Operation Epic Fury, the contrast is stark. America spent $25 billion, critically depleted its missile stockpiles, and tragically lost troops in a conflict that will take years, if not decades, to fully resolve. But contrast those explosive, costly, kinetic statistics with the silent, strategic gains made by Beijing. China greatly expanded its global influence, secured access to deeply discounted Iranian oil, and achieved absolute dominance in the accelerating global green tech sector, all without deploying a single soldier to the battlefield. Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer, looking at how perfectly the sequence of events aligned with Beijing's long-term economic and geopolitical goals. Did China plan this all along? Was this just brilliant real-time opportunism? Or are we looking at an absolute masterclass in strategic patience? I find this genuinely fascinating, and I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this. Drop your analysis in the comments below, and let's keep the active learning going. Thanks so much for letting me guide you through this, and I'll see you in the next explainer.